The invasion of Venezuela was never meant to be an invasion at all. Our tactical team observes that the operation, which concluded in late 2025, represented something fundamentally different from every military action in American history. There were no speeches about democracy, no promises of nation-building, no pretense of liberation. What occurred in Venezuela was not regime change in the traditional sense. It was asset repossession conducted at the scale of an entire nation-state. The difference is not semantic. It is tactical, financial, and represents a complete inversion of how modern superpowers project force in the 21st century. Traditional occupation is dead. The model that defined conflicts from Iraq to Afghanistan, the deployment of hundreds of thousands of ground troops to secure territory and rebuild infrastructure, has been recognized by Pentagon strategists as obsolete. Not because it is immoral or unpopular, though it is both, but because it is economically untenable and strategically inefficient. The cost per barrel calculation that drove American interest in Venezuela's oil reserves could not accommodate the trillion-dollar price tag of a conventional occupation. What emerged instead was a doctrine of control without presence, dominance without deployment, the ability to operate critical infrastructure in a hostile nation from thousands of miles away, not through puppet governments or local proxies, but through direct technological domination of the systems themselves. Venezuela possessed the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. The Orinoco Belt alone held an estimated 300 billion barrels of recoverable crude. For decades, this geological fortune had been squandered under socialist mismanagement, but the oil remained. When the Maduro regime finally collapsed under the weight of international sanctions and internal revolt, the scramble for control began immediately. What the world did not anticipate was that the battlefield would not be Caracas or Maracaibo. It would be the firmware embedded in 10,000 miles of pipeline infrastructure. The war would be fought in the operating systems of pumping stations, in the programmable logic controllers of refineries, in the SCADA networks that regulated pressure and flow across the entire hydrocarbon nervous system of the nation. And the enemy had already poisoned the ground. Russian and Chinese engineers had been embedded in Venezuela's energy sector for over a decade. They had rebuilt refineries. They had installed new pumping systems. They had digitized control networks that had once been analog and air-gapped. Gazprom technicians worked alongside Petro-China specialists to create what they believed was an impregnable technological fortress. Every critical system had been designed with a fail-deadly mechanism. If the Americans ever attempted to seize control, the entire network would brick itself into uselessness. The logic was simple and brutal. If we cannot have it, no one can. The technical term is a logic bomb, a malicious code sequence embedded deep within industrial control systems, dormant and undetectable during normal operations, but triggered by specific conditions. In the case of Venezuela, those conditions were designed to activate if the control systems detected an unauthorized access attempt, or if they lost contact with specific command servers located in Moscow and Beijing. Once triggered, the logic bombs would corrupt firmware, scramble authentication protocols, and permanently lock out all administrative access. The Russians and Chinese had effectively installed a self-destruct mechanism in the entire Venezuelan oil industry. They believed this made the assets worthless to any rival power. They believed the oil would stay in the ground forever, rather than flow to American refineries. They were wrong. The breakthrough came not from the CIA or from NSA cyber warfare units, but from a private defense contractor working under a black budget program that had been running in parallel to the public spectacle of regime change negotiations. SpaceX, operating under the Starshield program, had developed a capability that existed in the gap between signals intelligence and kinetic warfare. It was a form of attack that did not require network access, did not require physical presence, and could not be defended against by any conventional cybersecurity measure. It was an assault conducted entirely from low Earth orbit using nothing but precisely modulated microwave radiation. The principle is deceptively simple. but the execution requires a level of technical precision that only became possible in the last 3 years. Every digital system, every microprocessor, every circuit board in existence operates using quartz crystal oscillators to maintain timing. These oscillators vibrate at extraordinarily stable frequencies, typically in the megahertz range, and this vibration is what allows processors to synchronize operations and maintain coherent function. But quartz crystals are also piezoelectric. They respond to electromagnetic fields, and if you can manipulate those fields with enough precision, you can induce fluctuations in the oscillator frequency. You can inject noise into the timing signal. You can create conditions where the processor begins to misinterpret its own instructions. Starshield satellites orbiting at an altitude of 340 miles carried phased-array microwave emitters capable of focusing energy beams with a precision measured in meters. The targeting data came from signals intelligence that had mapped every control facility, every pumping station, every node in the Venezuelan oil infrastructure over a period of 18 months. The attack, when it came, was invisible. No explosions, no network intrusion, just a series of microwave pulses, each lasting milliseconds, each calibrated to a specific frequency, directed at the physical hardware controlling the Orinoco fields. The effect was catastrophic for the defense systems and surgical for the attackers. The logic bombs relied on processor integrity to execute their self-destruct sequences. But when the processors themselves began experiencing timing anomalies, when instructions started arriving out of sequence, when memory addresses became unreliable, the malicious code could not execute properly. It crashed. And in crashing, it created brief windows of vulnerability where the systems reverted to safe mode, to factory defaults, to states where authentication could be bypassed because the authentication mechanisms themselves were non-functional. Our technical analysts describe it as a firmware injection from space. While the logic bombs were thrashing in a state of induced malfunction, secondary Starshield payloads transmitted new operating code directly to the corrupted systems. Not through the network, not through any conventional communication protocol, but through direct radio frequency injection into the receiver circuits that every industrial control system possesses for legitimate remote diagnostics. The new firmware overwrote the compromised Russian and Chinese code. It re-established administrative access. It created new authentication hierarchies. And it did all of this in the span of 72 hours across an infrastructure network spanning 12,000 square miles. The Russians discovered what had happened when their command servers in Moscow suddenly showed every Venezuelan asset as offline. Not destroyed, not locked, simply gone, unreachable. The Chinese technical team stationed in Caracas reported the same phenomenon. The systems were running. Oil was flowing, but the control networks no longer answered to their commands. Every login attempt failed. Every diagnostic query returned nothing. It was as if the entire infrastructure had been plucked out of their hands by an invisible force. Because it had. By the time Russian intelligence understood the mechanism of the attack, it was already irreversible. The new firmware incorporated quantum-encrypted authentication protocols that could not be bypassed, could not be spoofed, and could not be attacked without physical access to hardware that was now under the protection of U.S. Special Operations Forces who had inserted quietly into key facilities during the chaos. The experts were baffled. Air-gapped systems are supposed to be immune to remote attack. That is the entire purpose of an air gap. But an air gap is only meaningful if you assume the attacker needs to bridge it through conventional means. SpaceX had simply reached down from orbit and rewritten the rules. The financial implications were immediate and brutal. China had invested an estimated $40 billion in Venezuelan energy infrastructure over the previous decade. Russia had committed another $20 billion through Rosneft and Gazprom partnerships. These investments were predicated on long-term extraction agreements that would have given both nations access to crude oil at preferential rates for 30 years. Overnight, those agreements became worthless. The assets they had built, the refineries they had modernized, the pipelines they had laid, all of it now operated under American control. The contracts were void. The governments in Beijing and Moscow had no legal recourse because the Venezuelan government that had signed those contracts no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Technical humiliation does not adequately describe what occurred. This was the single largest asset seizure in the history of modern geopolitics, conducted without firing a shot at the infrastructure itself, and it was accomplished through a weapons system that most defense analysts did not know existed. The downstream economic effects are still unfolding. Russia lost its primary leverage point in Latin America. China lost a critical hedge against Middle Eastern oil supply disruptions. Both nations lost credibility with every other developing country that had accepted their infrastructure investments, because the unspoken promise of those investments was that they would create dependencies that could be exploited. Venezuela proved that those dependencies could be severed instantly if the United States decided the assets were worth taking. And take them we did. Within weeks of the satellite handshake operation, as it became known in classified briefings, Chevron and ExxonMobil had personnel on the ground in the Orinoco Belt, not thousands of workers, not even hundreds. A few dozen highly specialized engineers whose job was not to operate the facilities, but to verify that the remote operation systems were functioning correctly. Because the facilities are not operated from Venezuela. They are operated from Houston, Texas. From climate-controlled operation centers where technicians monitor real-time data feeds transmitted via encrypted Starshield links, where AI systems optimize extraction rates and pipeline flows, where every valve and pump and separator in the Venezuelan oil fields can be controlled with the same ease that a drone pilot in Nevada controls an aircraft over Yemen. This is the architecture of the Petro-Protectorate. It is not a colony in the traditional sense. There is no American governor in Caracas. There is no occupation force patrolling the streets. Venezuela has a government of sorts, a transitional administration that Washington recognizes and that manages civil affairs. But that government does not control the oil. It cannot. The control systems are not accessible to them. The revenue from oil sales flows through accounts managed by the U.S. Treasury, and Venezuela receives a percentage as determined by an agreement that was non-negotiable because there was no alternative. The choice presented to the transitional government was simple. Accept American operation of the energy sector and receive a share of the profits, or reject the arrangement and receive nothing because the oil will be extracted regardless. They accepted. Our tactical team observes that this model is vastly more efficient than traditional occupation. The cost of maintaining the satellite network and the remote operations centers is measured in hundreds of millions annually. The revenue from Venezuelan oil production, now flowing at rates not seen since the 1990s due to optimized extraction and the restoration of long-neglected infrastructure, is measured in tens of billions annually. The return on investment is unprecedented. There is no insurgency to suppress because there are no occupiers to target. There is no reconstruction burden because the only infrastructure that matters, the oil infrastructure, is operated remotely and defended by systems that do not require human presence. But there is surveillance. Total, unblinking, inescapable surveillance. The Orinoco Panopticon, as some intelligence analysts have begun calling it, is perhaps the most sophisticated monitoring system ever deployed over a civilian population. It is not designed to control people. It is designed to control access to infrastructure. Every pipeline, every wellhead, every storage facility, every kilometer of the oil network is monitored by overlapping sensor grids. Starshield satellites provide continuous overhead coverage. Autonomous drones patrol pipeline routes on randomized schedules. Ground-based sensors detect vibration signatures that indicate tampering. Acoustic monitors identify the sound of tools on metal. Thermal cameras track heat signatures near critical facilities. The system does not wait for sabotage to occur. It identifies intent before action. If an individual approaches a pipeline valve in a rural area, far from any legitimate work site, the system flags the approach. If that individual carries tools consistent with those used to tap pipelines, the system escalates the alert. If the individual reaches for the valve, the system has already dispatched a response, either a local security patrol or, in remote areas, a drone equipped with less lethal deterrent systems. The response time is measured in minutes. The monitoring is continuous, the message is clear. The infrastructure is untouchable. This level of control would have been impossible to maintain through human patrols. The Orinoco Belt covers an area larger than Florida. The pipeline network extends for thousands of miles through jungles, mountains, and plains. A conventional occupation force would require tens of thousands of troops just to secure the critical nodes, and even then, sabotage would be routine. But the Panopticon does not sleep. It does not require rotation schedules or supply lines. It does not suffer from morale problems. It simply watches, analyzes, and responds, and it does so with an efficiency that human forces cannot match. The psychological effect on the population is difficult to quantify, but appears to be significant. There are no mass protests against the American presence because there is no visible American presence to protest. There are no attacks on oil infrastructure because everyone understands that such attacks are impossible. The surveillance net is common knowledge. It is not hidden. The drones are visible. The satellite coverage is acknowledged in public statements by the transitional government. The population has adapted to the reality that the oil sector exists in a separate security domain, one that they cannot access and cannot disrupt. Some analysts have suggested that this creates a form of learned helplessness, a recognition that resistance is not merely dangerous, but futile. Others argue that it is simply pragmatic acceptance. The oil flows. The revenue it generates funds the government services that have been restored after years of collapse under Maduro. The lights are on. The hospitals have medicine. The currency is stable because it is now backed by oil revenue managed through international accounts. For the average Venezuelan, the question of who controls the oil infrastructure is less important than the fact that life has improved. But there are lessons here that extend far beyond Venezuela. The geopolitical implications of the satellite handshake operation have not been lost on adversaries. Iran, which possesses a similarly complex oil infrastructure and which has been hardening its systems against cyber attack for years, has reportedly begun a comprehensive review of its industrial control systems. The Iranians understand that if the Americans could remotely compromise Venezuelan infrastructure, the same techniques could be applied to Karg Island, to the refineries at Abadan, to the pipeline networks that carry Iranian crude to export terminals. The air gap is no longer a meaningful defense. The Iranians know it. The Chinese know it. The Russians learned it the hard way. China has responded by accelerating its own satellite warfare programs, but our intelligence assessments suggest they are years behind the capabilities demonstrated by Starshield. The technical requirements for the microwave injection attack are extraordinary. The targeting precision, the signal modulation, the ability to induce controlled malfunctions without causing permanent damage, all of these require advances in phased array technology and AI-driven targeting systems that China has not yet achieved. They are trying. But trying is not the same as succeeding, and the gap may be widening rather than closing. Russia, humiliated by the loss of its Venezuelan investments and the exposure of its logic bomb strategy as ineffective, has withdrawn from several planned infrastructure projects in Africa and Central Asia. The message from potential client states has been clear. If Russian technology can be overridden from orbit, what value does Russian partnership provide? The answer, increasingly, is very little. Russian prestige in the developing world rested on the perception that Moscow could offer an alternative to American dominance, a partnership that came without the strings of Western liberal democracy. But Venezuela demonstrated that Russian technology comes with its own strings, and those strings can be cut by an adversary with superior capabilities. The war that Donald Trump promised to wage to reclaim American energy dominance has been fought and won, not through tariffs or sanctions, but through the deployment of capabilities that most of the world did not know existed. The oil flowing from the Orinoco Belt to refineries on the Texas Gulf Coast is not simply fueling the American economy. It is paying for the operation itself, funding the satellite network, funding the operations centers, funding the development of next-generation systems that will extend the same model of control to other regions. Because Venezuela is not the endpoint, it is the proof of concept. Our tactical team observes that similar assessments are being conducted for every major oil-producing nation that is either hostile to the United States or politically unstable. The technical parameters are being refined. The targeting protocols are being optimized. The legal frameworks, such as they are being established through classified directives that will not be made public for decades. The infrastructure exists. The capability is proven. The only question is where it will be applied next. Nicolás Maduro sits in a federal detention facility in Brooklyn, awaiting trial on narco-terrorism charges. His regime is gone. His allies in Moscow and Beijing were unable to protect him or the assets they had invested in his country. The oil that was supposed to fund a socialist revolution is now funding American energy independence and underwriting the military operations that maintain global stability as Washington defines it. The infrastructure that was supposed to be sabotaged beyond repair is operating at higher efficiency than at any point in the last 30 years. This is not a victory in the traditional sense. There were no parades, no declarations, no moment when the American flag was raised over a captured capital. But it is a victory nonetheless, and it is a type of victory that redefines what victory means in the 21st century. It is control without occupation, dominance without deployment, the ability to extract resources from a sovereign nation not through conquest but through technological superiority so overwhelming that resistance is not merely defeated, but rendered conceptually impossible. The air gap is a myth. The logic bomb is obsolete. The satellite network is omnipresent. These are the lessons of Venezuela, and they are lessons that adversaries around the world are studying with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. Because if it can be done to Venezuela, it can be done to anyone. The only variable is whether Washington decides the assets are worth taking. And in a world where energy is power, where oil is currency, where control of critical infrastructure is the ultimate form of leverage, that decision will be made again. Perhaps soon. Perhaps against a target that has convinced itself that its defenses are adequate, that its systems are secure, that its sovereignty is protected by international law and the threat of retaliation. Venezuela believed all of those things. Venezuela was wrong. The next target will be wrong too, because the future of warfare is not boots on the ground. It is satellites in orbit, microwave beams penetrating air-gapped systems, and engineers in Houston controlling infrastructure on the other side of the world. The future of warfare is invisible, efficient, and utterly ruthless. The Petro-Protectorate is not an aberration. It is the template, and the sky, as always, belongs to those who control it.